Hi, welcome to the Always Evolving podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Elizabeth Fedrick. Setting and holding boundaries is one of the best things that we can do for ourselves and our relationships. But when does a boundary move from being healthy into being controlling? Joining us today are Jan and Jillian Yuhas, relationship and boundary experts. Jan and Jillian are here to help us to identify the difference between a healthy boundary and a controlling ultimatum. It's okay that we don't have it all figured out. We're all just taking it a day at a time. This is Always Evolving with Dr. Liz. Jillian and Jan, welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have you guys here.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, absolutely. So we are going to talk about the difference between boundaries and ultimatums. Boundaries are such a hot topic right now. Everybody wants to set their boundaries. Everybody, really wants to advocate for themselves in that way, which is a beautiful thing. But we tend to see it go maybe a little bit overboard in some ways. So what are you guys' thoughts around the difference between boundaries and ultimatums?
So a lot of times when people are setting boundaries, sometimes they think they're setting a boundary, but really sometimes they're setting an ultimatum. And so the difference for us is that it's a me mindset versus a we mindset when it comes to our relationship boundaries. So when it comes to setting boundaries, if you have a me mindset and you're setting a unilateral boundary based on your perspective only within a relationship dynamic, this is a one-sided projection that can be displaced onto the connection, and the other party may not understand where you're coming from or really want to honor that boundary because they don't feel like they have a voice in that situation.
Sure. So they might perceive it more like a threat or an attack, or like they are feeling like this is selfish or one-sided versus something that you're trying to do for the both of you.
Correct. Yeah, they actually feel like this person's trying to have power or control over me, which typically leads to the other person either being defensive or shutting down, and they just lead to maladaptive behaviors, which doesn't allow for that connection or resolution to occur if there is a disconnect or we don't like a certain behavior that's happening in the relationship.
Absolutely. And I agree. And with all of the social media buzzwords and trends and everything, just like pushing people, set your boundaries, which again, for a lot of us people pleasers, or, we tend to end up maybe more in the codependency role. That is good for us to learn how to do that. But we also see that we swing to the other end of the spectrum, and then it is now disconnecting. What are some tips that you guys give when you're working with people on, like, what even, I guess, if you were even to identify a healthy boundary to start with, like, what definition do you give to that?
So we really help individuals develop their value system to operate from, like their top 5 values within the connection in order to get their needs met, because our values get our emotional needs met, but from a logical perspective that the other person is able to understand. Universally, our values are much more easier to understand than emotions. So when we're working with someone, when we operate from those top 5 values, it makes it easier to set boundaries from our value system in order to make requests, in order to negotiate an agreement based on that shared value within the relationship.
So do you suggest for a couple to identify values together, or it's more making your partner, this other person, aware of your own personal values? How do you navigate that?
Yeah, we have each of them identify their own values, but then let's say they both value communication. Well, that could look different for each one of them in regards to what communication looks like. So then we help them explore, okay, how often do you need to communicate? What does that look like? What's the response time in terms of messages or calls? So really helping them create boundaries around that value of communication, just because it can look different from perspectives from their own upbringings, and then trying to combine those and create mutual agreements around that value.
Yeah, what is a common example that you guys see where this is confused, a boundary and an ultimatum? Because even as you're talking, I'm like, yeah, I know where you're headed with that. So for the people listening, might be a couple examples of where we think we're setting a boundary, but we're actually maybe being kind of controlling?
So when a person's actually telling their partner or someone else, like a family member, what to do versus saying, hey, this makes me feel uncomfortable. I value, open conversation or communication. Can we sit down? How can we work on this together? So you're making that request to
form the agreement or connection when there's a disconnect, versus saying, I need you to call me every hour, or I need you to call me as soon as I call you. That's dictating someone, telling them what to do, versus saying, I need something, but how can we find a way to work on that together? So we're honoring the relationship and elevating it. So it's not me versus you, it's we versus the relationship problem.
So telling somebody, I need you to call me at a certain time, that is not a boundary. So that is a request. That is a need that you're expressing. That is not a boundary. But maybe saying something like,
Can you call me? Yeah.
Sure. Would be a great way to verbalize that request. But a boundary might be on the flip side, like, I'm not going to be available to call you after 8 p.m. because now you're talking about you. It's not about what they're going to do. It's about your behavior. Is that kind of the distinction you're making with it?
I think, well, so often when you're working with other people, it's important to negotiate boundaries around the relationship, especially if you want that relationship to evolve. You can have a personal boundary which says, I will not be taking calls after 8 p.m. So that's more of a personal boundary versus a relationship boundary. I think that's where, we try to distinguish the difference. Sure. Because at the same time, you can communicate that. But if there is actually a disconnect or a disagreement, you have to work on it together as a team, more or less, to get to that mutual beneficial agreement that's going to support the relationship.
And so what is some verbiage even that you guys suggest for clients around this? Like, let's say they've been really struggling and they're like, I keep telling my partner X, Y, and Z. And you're sitting there like, okay, that's not a boundary. That's not a boundary. How do you then say, okay, well, maybe let's try this verbiage instead? What does the verbiage sound like?
So we would use our I statements and we statements. So let's say the partner is feeling undervalued in the relationship. So they might say, I feel undervalued when you take phone calls from XYZ during dinner hour. I value mutual partnership. How can we find a way to honor our relationship while out to dinner?
Okay. And what is some pushback that you guys hear around when you guys talk about the difference between boundaries and ultimatums? What's some pushback you guys get on that?
With business people, they completely understand it because they understand negotiations. But I think a lot of times with personal relationships, people think, oh, you're just making requests. That's not a boundary. Yes, but at the same time, you have to honor that mutual respect if you want someone to work with you and collaborate and find ways to be a better team. It really makes a huge difference because the other person then feels respected and they don't feel like they're being told what to do or given an ultimatum or said, you must do XYZ or else I'm out of here. So are you just going to end the relationship? Well, that doesn't solve the problem to begin with.
Right.
What happens a lot of times when people set or they think they're setting boundaries or setting an ultimatum is that the relationship problem never gets resolved and it just becomes a repetitive cycle.
Yeah. What is some resistance that you hear from people receiving boundaries, and how do you maybe help people to work through that? Because that can be hard for us too, right? Like, it's hard to set them, but it can also be really hard to receive or respect them.
So if someone's feeling resistant around the boundaries or hearing them for the first time, and we always, say, it can obviously feel like a foreign language, but we help people navigate by using discovery questions. So help me understand what's difficult about this, or can you share more so I can better understand how I can help us work through this together. So we have open-ended discovery questions that allow us to gain further insight and understand what the other person's thinking or feeling. So that way, then we can dig down to the root cause and then go back to the boundary and work around it that way.
Yeah, I love that. So if you could each give one takeaway for people listening about how they can set better boundaries that are actual boundaries and not ultimatums or not mere suggestions, what would each of you say, just like one nugget of takeaway?
Just have a we mindset. Think about the relationship versus just your needs, and think about as if you're in your partner's shoes or your family member's shoes, and think about, okay, how can we work better as, like I said, together in order to elevate that relationship?
So important.
I think I would say that's probably the biggest thing is that we always talk about is having a we mindset versus a me mindset, but also be willing to be more open-minded in terms of negotiating a solution that meets both parties' perspectives and come to a mutual agreement. Because our boundaries method is a blend of interpersonal psychology and negotiation skills in order to mutually benefit the relationship and the connection to keep evolving and growing.
Yeah, such a good insight, because we tend to have these narratives in our head, or we think that things can only go one certain way, or I absolutely can't be happy if it doesn't happen this way. And to challenge the perspective and really assess, like, where's this story coming from that I'm telling myself, and how can I look at these other perspectives? That's really how we do the best collaboration with, whether it's business or romantic or whatever relationship it is. So,
Yep.
Yes, great insights. Where can people find you? What are your social media websites? Where can you be found?
Yeah, they can find us at Jan and Jillian on Instagram or janandjillian.com.
Very good. Well, thank you, Jan and Jillian. I appreciate you being here. Such good information. And thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
And thank you all for joining us on the Always Evolving podcast. If you like what you heard, make sure to rate and review this episode, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and find me on Instagram at Dr. Elizabeth Fedrick. This is Always Evolving with Dr. Liz.